Good morning, everyone. So, I wouldn't be totally offended if you wanted to move closer. It would be okay, just so you know. You always have that freedom to sit closer to the front. You also have the freedom to stay where you are. There, we'll just make sure this is good. So yeah, we're talking about parables, and I don't know if you've been here the last couple of weeks. We have what we have now dubbed the parable chair. So when we're talking about parables, we're talking about the stories Jesus told. I like calling them the short stories of Jesus. And I like to imagine us sitting and relaxing, and kind of that defenses down bit when you're reading a story or listening to a story. You're kind of not thinking about all your responses to something. You're just listening and taking it in. So that's why the chair is here to remind us to I wonder what this story has for me, like you do with any normal story you read. So that's why the chair is there. But we're talking about a specific parable from Matthew 18 on forgiveness. It's dubbed the parable of the unforgiving servant or the unmerciful servant. So we're going to talk about it. And I've been thinking about forgiveness a lot the last couple weeks. And I was just doing a quick run through of my playlists and the songs on my phone and trying to see where forgiveness comes up. And it actually comes up in almost every album you'll listen to. There's something about forgiveness. Does anybody remember that Don Henley song, I've been trying to get to the heart of the matter? No one? No one from the 80s? Okay, there we go. India RE also did a great cover of it, if you want that version. So you know the lines in the song, I've been trying to get down to the heart of the matter, but everything changes and my friends seem to scatter, but I think it's about forgiveness, even if you don't love me anymore, right? That song, now that's going to be in your head all week, because it's been in my head all week. I was going through, there's another song by the Decemberists called An Apology Song, and it's actually this very sweet song where he apologizes for losing his friend's bike. His friend had given him a bike to hold while his friend went away. He didn't lock it up, it got stolen, and he felt so bad, so he wrote this song. I'm really sorry, Stephen, but your bicycle's been stolen. I was watching it for you till you came back in the fall. I guess I didn't do such a good job after all. I was feeling really sorry, Stephen, and I spent all morning grieving. So I wrote you this song in the hopes you'd forgive me, even though it was wrong, being so careless with a thing so great and taking your poor Madeline away. That's what the bike was called. And then, because I'm in a deeply unironic Dolly Parton phase, I had to include this one. From 1969, No, I Can't. I just can't. I can't forgive you this time. If I did, I know you'd just do me wrong, and you hurt me again. I'm fresh out of forgiveness for you. I'm fresh out of forgiveness for you. And then we were talking about this last song. The Dixie Chicks wrote this song, Not Ready to Make Nice, and it's just so fascinating. I think it's actually very honest about how we hold forgiveness, because it's not a snap thing, is it? I can't bring myself to do what it is you think I should do. What it is you think I should. Forgive sounds good. Forget, I'm not sure I could. They say time heals everything, but I'm still waiting. So I just liked the breadth of trying to get at something that every human's going to deal with. There's a few things every human on this planet at all times will have to maneuver through, and forgiveness is one of them. And it's also one of the hardest things we have to work through. Because like I said, it's not a snap thing that you can just decide and it happens, right? The disciples were obviously talking about this, which is what brings us to this passage today. But I wanted to say kind of at the outset that, I've been sitting with this parable for a few weeks, and honestly, and I'm also aware, by nature of the work I do, and the people I meet at universities and here, but I'm aware of the damage humans can do to one another. I also am a human. I've experienced some of the damage humans can do to one another. And the last thing I think that someone who has been hurt, and the last thing someone might need from a pastor is just to be told to stop being angry and forgive. So I kind of walked into this text with a little bit of tentativeness, knowing that's sometimes the message we get when we come to church and talk about forgiveness. So I wanted to just invite you and invite me to be tentative as we walk to this passage, to be sensitive to the Spirit, and hearing what each of us are being asked to hear by this gracious, unaccusing Spirit of God. If ever you're sitting in a church and you hear an accusing voice, that's not God. But you might hear a challenging voice. You might hear a poking voice, but if it's affirming, if it's this is what is good for you and it knows you, that is God's voice. An accusing voice, a shaming voice, that's not God. So I just wanted to open up our time with that acknowledgement. But we're going to get to the passage, and it starts with Peter, Peter who we are all really similar with. Too similar to be comfortable with, that's the right thing. In this passage, Peter is coming to Jesus. And he seems to honestly want to know just how much he needs to let go of how much people have hurt him. He's asking, how do I live this life as your disciple right, Jesus? So if my brother does something against me and it's not right and I have to forgive him, is 7 times a good amount? And I was thinking about this. If my brother honestly did something, let's say he stole $100 from my purse, and he did it once, and I forgave him, that's fine. If he did it a second time, and I forgave him, okay. He did it a third time, and I forgave him. A fourth time, and I forgave him. Okay, you get the point. Like 7 times, forgiving someone for the same thing is actually a fair amount of forgiveness. Peter wants to know what the boundaries are, and I think he seems to already have pushed them pretty far. And I like to imagine Jesus hearing this question. And so I imagine maybe Peter came up to them, maybe they were walking somewhere, gathering something, maybe Jesus leaned his head a little, his ear closer to Peter so he could hear better, that kind of lean in when you're trying to understand where someone's coming from. And I imagine Jesus waiting a beat after that question, maybe taking in a deep breath and stopping. And imagine him looking into his friend's eyes and saying, oh friend, actually you're going to have to forgive more like 70 times 7. And as I read it this time, I heard something different in Jesus' reply. I'm telling you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. I heard him say, you're going to need to forgive infinitely, really, indefinitely, again and again. It's not just that you're going to have to get better at forgiveness, you're going to have to be a better person. It's just that people are going to need that kind of forgiveness over and over. 70 times 7 things are going to need to be let go of. And then Jesus uses his favorite tool, his favorite digging deeper tool, and he tells a story. So I'm just going to retell the story. I have the scriptures up on the screen behind me. So Jesus starts the story like this. Because you're going to have to forgive so much, the kingdom is like this. It's like a ruler wants to get what's owed him. Like he's keeping his books, he's keeping good records. And so he brings up one of his servants who owes him a lot. Like a lot. The amount that Jesus says is literally decades worth of income in that time. It's an astronomical sum that this servant owes. Everyone listening knows that there's no way this servant could ever pay back this sum. And as the story goes, the servant's like, I can't. And the bookkeeper ruler says, well, to the stocks with you and your whole family. Like, you can't be here anymore if you can't pay it back. You messed up, you can't make it up. And the servant then asks for forgiveness. Says, have mercy on me, just be patient, I will pay it back, I just need a little bit more time, he says to the ruler. And in a heartbeat, the ruler says, actually, you know what, you're probably not going to get it all together, so I'm just going to eliminate your debt altogether. You owe me nothing. You're not on the hook, I'm letting go of your obligation to make it up to me. The words in the scriptures are, the ruler took pity, and it's that took pity word is the same Greek word that's used countless of times to describe Jesus' compassion towards people. It's that same word that means like he was moved in his bowels to feel what the person was feeling, to feel the humanity of the servant, the fear of the servant, the inability of that servant to make it right. So, and from that feeling of compassion, the ruler canceled the debt and let him go. And that's a good story. I like that story. I'm like, yeah, I can get behind that story. But this is not where Jesus stops his story. He throws a rather interesting twist in. Because then this forgiven, let off the hook servant, who turns out to be kind of just as harsh of a bookkeeper as his master was, he went out and he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. And he grabbed him and he began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. And his fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him with the exact same words he used with his master, be patient with me and I will pay it back. But the forgiven servant refused to be patient. He refused to let this other debtor be in need of mercy. He refused to wait for him any longer. He refused to let him go from his obligation to repay him. Instead, he had the man thrown into prison until he could pay his debt. And the story goes on. Now, when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged, and they went and told their master everything that had happened. And the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" And in anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you until you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. And all of a sudden, this story went from feeling nice and good and fuzzy to not so good and fuzzy. It went from a grace story, and it ended in this kind of dark place of torture and imprisonment. It's disconcerting and it's disturbing. And I was thinking, it's too bad the Gospels did not record Peter's facial expression, like, "I just asked a question," like, "Sorry I asked," or just very confused. That's my response to it. And this story about forgiveness doesn't seem to lend itself to a nice platitude. There's actually a lot in the scriptures that don't lend itself to a nice platitude, or not a platitude we're comfortable with, and I think that's the intent. I think Jesus is requiring us to wrestle with forgiveness, to wrestle with our deep heart. He turns it back into your heart, unless you forgive from your heart. He wants us to get into this tangle of our hearts, and I think that's his intent. So let's wrestle this morning with this passage. So the word forgive in this passage, it's a Greek word. It literally means to let go, like to be released from, to release from obligation. So in my head, I'm imagining, the image that came to my mind when I was reading that, it was like, say I was holding a rope, and someone had done something to me, and what they owed me was on the other side of that rope. And forgiveness is really just letting go of what they owed me, letting go of them fulfilling the obligation to pay me back for what they have done, right? The trespass against me does not have to be rectified. I've let it go. That, to me, is a good image of forgiveness. And Jesus said that's what the kingdom is like. So what is forgiveness? What does this letting go say about God and the way he works? There's a Croatian theologian named Miroslav Volf. He's really, a really great theologian. I had the chance to hear him speak once. He was conscripted into the Croatian army during the Bosnian War. His father was tortured in a concentration camp. His brother was killed by accident, but pretty gruesomely by a soldier during those years. He himself was interrogated mercilessly for days and days and days and repeatedly. He was always under suspect because he was not a communist and he was not an Orthodox. He was just himself. And then he wrote a book about grace after living through the horrors. We remember the horrors of the Bosnian War. He wrote a book about grace, and it's called Free of Charge, Giving and Forgiving in a Culture Stripped of Grace. And he writes that often we humans, we kind of vacillate between conceiving of God as like a litigating and negotiating God. Like that means like if you do this, God, I'll do this, that kind of thing. Or God is like that, a negotiating God. And if you have a negotiating God, you're always going to end up with a judgment God because we don't always fulfill our ends of that negotiation, do we? And when a judgment God becomes untenable, because it always does, we cannot live under unmitigated judgment, it makes it hard to see goodness. We swing then to kind of the rich grandparent God. Rich grandparents are great. Nothing bad about rich grandparents. But sometimes Wolf calls it Santa God. Sometimes we vacillate to this God who is about giving us what we want, what we deserve. It focuses on those nice fuzzies, which are not bad in their space, but that actually kind of gets untenable too, because it leads to a spirituality that's just kind of about consuming and collecting those nice feelings, collecting those experiences, maybe sometimes forgetting that following Jesus has as much to do with taking up your cross and defending the cause of the widow and the orphan and co-laboring towards shalom. So Wolf says, at the crux of our faith, when we look at Jesus, we see that the truest character of God is that he is forgiving God. So he's not judgment God and he's not Santa God. He's actually forgiving God. And I think this holds true as I wander through this, because what else could God be to a beloved creation that he's forever fastened himself to? Of course, it is his deepest nature to be forgiving. I like my favorite phrase. I come up with phrases. that I've been saying to myself as I deal with my kids, as I deal with my own self, is that God starts this in love and he finishes it in love. He's forgiving at the first and forgiving at the last. Grace started all of this. Grace finishes all this. And that is the image of Christ, who is the image of the invisible God. So when Jesus says, oh, Peter, you're going to have to forgive indefinitely and always and over, this really struck me this week as good news. Because I think what this parable it's saying to me is that it's acknowledging that humans are going to fail. It's good news to me to know that my Creator knows I'm going to fail. That's not a secret to him. I'm not going to get it all right. We will not see or understand everything there is to see or understand about any situation we find ourselves in. And because of that, we will inevitably maybe hurt one another. And God's well aware of that. So by telling this story, I think Jesus turns the gaze back from what we do to what's going on kind of deep in our own hearts. And this parable shows our own hearts a theology of failure, that we will falter and we will need to forgive and we will need to be forgiven a lot. And it's jarring in maybe our culture that adores success. Actually, our culture functions on winning, doesn't it? It doesn't just like it actually idolizes it, right? So an idol is where you sacrifice good things so that something good will come back to you, right? So if I'm sacrificed to the winning idol, I might sacrifice my health so that I will win. I might sacrifice my relationship with my kids so that I can be successful. Like, it's an idol in our culture. Sometimes when we need help from the government or from our family, sometimes when we need anti-anxiety meds, sometimes needing help at all is kind of suspect, right? You kind of dismiss someone, they don't have it all together. I don't know if I need to listen to them if they don't have it all together. This bar of kind of perfection keeps being raised. None of us can reach it. I was just thinking, raising kids in a perfection bar raising culture, like you need them to have straight A's, you need them to be self-sufficient, you need them to have perfect bodies so that they just keep functioning. You need yourself to have perfect bodies, you need to have perfect marriages. Kids who win. We live in a culture where only success is good, and even failure is sometimes repackaged and sold on Instagram as a means to success, right? But the truth is that we will fail, and sometimes spectacularly so. We will get it wrong. When did we start thinking that it was all up to us to live perfectly? And we had to do it on our own. When did we start to demand perfection from those around us? Needing grace is so hard, and giving grace is so hard. And I think giving grace is extra hard when our image of God is one that demands you keep trying to be perfect and that your worth is dependent on that. Giving grace is in fact impossible with judgment God, meaning you can't let yourself off the hook, let alone someone else. Robert Capon wrote, "Grace doesn't sell. You can hardly give it away because it kind of only works for losers and no one wants to stand in that line. The world of winners will buy case lots of moral advice, grosses of guilt-edged prohibitions, skids of self-improvement techniques, whole truckloads of transcendental hot air, but it will not buy free forgiveness because that threatens to let the riffraff into the supper of the Lamb." And I wonder if it's only when we really know ourselves to need grace that resurrection power has some room to move. Because admitting failure, needing forgiveness, is as much a death as anything. And maybe like a death, it's a prerequisite for resurrection. And I'm thinking about this, a church that's about winning or appearing to win at all times offers nothing to the world that it doesn't already get from all sides. But a church that offers a place to hold failure and forgiveness and genuineness, holding it open to God and out to each other in honesty, that takes a lot of boldness and mercy. That's something that's not seen very often. And I think that's a place of resurrection where new life can actually happen in a group of people and in our own hearts. Now, that's not to say that what someone does against you is to be forgotten, right? It's never to be glossed over. Forgiveness never means you have to stay silent. It does not mean you stay in a relationship that hurts you, that damages the image of God in you. In fact, forgiveness doesn't say it doesn't matter. It actually says it very much does matter. Forgiveness requires that we name what happened was wrong, very wrong. You've done this and it hurt me and it affected me. I'm naming the wrong here. And yet, forgiveness says, I'm going to choose to not be bound in this anger and hatred forever. I'll take you and the pain you caused off my own hook. Give it to God's hook. Let God do with that what he will. I'm going to let go of the rope. So I'll name the wrong, I'll name the effect of that wrong, and then I'll cut off the weight you've put on me by forgiving, by letting go of the debt you owe me over this. I will cut off the weight that's on my life. And I think the hope is that by doing that, by offering free grace, there is goodness that grows out of that and healing that grows out of that. Never, 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 never does God say, you must forgive and nothing will change. Just stay in the same patterns of abuse or oppression or anything like that. That's not what God says. But we know that forgiveness is God's nature, and so I can assume that his forgiveness is going to shape me the more I hang around this Jesus. This kind of forgiveness is the hardest thing, and I actually think it takes a lifetime. Karen, one of our worship leaders at our meeting last week, she said forgiveness to her is like, it's like a train passing, right? So you start the process of forgiveness with that first engine, the engine of the train. But you know what? It takes a long time for it to keep going and to keep passing, to finish the work. It seems to like you'll come around and around to points of forgiveness. And I think that's the wrestling we get to do, but we get to do that alongside a kind-eyed Christ. There's one last twist in the story of Jesus, this last detail about the debt-forgiving ruler. I thought he was a nice guy. Tossing the unforgiving servant into a pit. That's troubling, right? Because the story of grace kind of ends rather brutally. But I wonder if it seems like Jesus is making a pretty discomforting point. That the thing that will ultimately spell your demise is not the debt you owe, but the lack of mercy with others' debts. Barbara Brown Taylor wrote, the wicked servant's imprisonment, it's actually a technicality. This servant was already behind bars of his own making. By refusing to be forgiven, refusing to forgive, he had already created his own little Alcatraz where he sat in solitary confinement with his calculator, keeping track of accounts. Capon again wrote, it's just misery to try and keep count of what God is no longer counting. And Jesus leaves us with this thought in the parable. It's not the debt you owe that will ultimately imprison you and torture you. It's actually the lack of mercy with the debt that others owe you. Miroslav Volf, it's hard to say, Miroslav Volf, he spent a lot of time thinking about how to forgive his interrogators and how hard that is. He spent a lot of time wondering, what would I say if I actually met this guy in real life again? And he ends his book with a lot of hard questions. Questions like, why do Christians, whose being and story is totally dependent on trusting in him, who justifies the ungodly, why is extending grace so hard? Why are we hearing at public prayer meetings, calls for payback, taking up your sword against your enemies? Why have so many Christian leaders and parents left so much suffering in their own trails? Why do we refuse this God-given bridge from vengeance to forgiveness? And he ends without answering those questions because they are good questions to wrestle with. While we wrestle, I pray that we would know grace too. He also wrote, whatever the reasons, when forgiveness does happen, it's a miracle of grace. The obstacles in its way are immense. Grace holds even in the wrestling. I'm going to end this morning by reading a passage from Romans 12. It's written by Paul, who wrestled with his own failure and his own forgiveness stuff. Paul was such a great human. Dr. Wolf says it's one of his favorites, and he reads it every day. So I thought maybe we should read it too when we're thinking about forgiveness. So Romans, let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Never flag in zeal, be aglow with the Spirit. Serve the Lord, rejoice in your hope. Be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. Repay no one evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. And if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Now if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink. For by doing so you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Because this is the Lord's. You are the Lord's, and this is what participating in God's kingdom looks like. It looks like grace.